Hey there, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. Get ready to unlock some fascinating psych knowledge with me today. We're skipping the whole semester of lectures and jumping right into those aha moments. You know, the ones that make you see yourself and like everyone else a little bit differently?
Let's just say we're diving into the good part.
I love it. Okay, so from what I see, you've flagged sections on research methods. There's a bit about the brain, child development, and some stuff on stress. Oh, and then things get really juicy. Sleep, hypnosis, even lie detectors. It's all in here.
You've got the highlights. And you know what's really interesting? A lot of these topics, they actually connect in surprising ways. Like, if you understand how psychological research works, it can actually help you spot misleading claims like everywhere. From the news to what you see on social media, even those facts everyone just seems to believe.
Okay, being able to spot misinformation, definitely super useful these days. And speaking of things that sound made up, you highlighted the Milgram experiment. That's the one where people thought they were delivering like actual electric shocks, right? That's intense.
Exactly. It's a classic example of just how powerful social pressure can be. People were willing to inflict what they believed was real pain just because someone, in a lab coat told them to.
It's like you think you'd stand up to that, but then the experiment shows how easily we can be swayed by authority.
And that's a dynamic that plays out in so many ways, right? Whether it's following orders at work, even when something feels off, or just blindly trusting like charismatic figures. The Milgram experiment, it really forces us to examine how we respond to authority, like in our own lives.
It's a good reminder to check in with your own moral compass every now and then.
Right. Absolutely.
And speaking of questioning assumptions, there was a section you marked on bias. Something about how often people think they're right, even when they're totally wrong.
Yes, the overconfidence error. Turns out we're wired to overestimate, like all the time, our abilities and our knowledge. There was this one study where people had to judge how likely events were, and even when they were certain they were right, they were still wrong 10% of the time.
Ouch. 10% is way higher than I would like to admit. It makes you wonder how many times we're convinced we're right, but we're actually missing, key information.
And that's the key takeaway here. Knowing about the overconfidence error can help us be more humble about our own judgments and be more willing to consider, different perspectives. It's a good reminder that none of us are immune to bias.
Okay, this is getting a little too real.
Yeah.
But on that note, how do we become more aware of our own biases? Is it just about constantly second-guessing ourselves?
It's less about second-guessing and more about cultivating a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it comes to information that confirms what we already believe.
So questioning those headlines that seem a little too good to be true, or, digging a little deeper when an expert opinion feels perfectly aligned with our own views.
You got it. And that's actually where understanding those research methods becomes so valuable. Knowing how data is collected and how it's interpreted, it helps you see beyond the surface and evaluate information more critically.
Okay, I can definitely get behind that. It's about being, an active participant in forming our own opinions, not just passive consumers of whatever's thrown at us.
Yes.
So it's not just about avoiding being wrong. It's about making more informed decisions overall, right?
Exactly. And that applies to everything from evaluating health claims to making financial decisions to even, navigating those heated political debates.
This is already making me rethink how I process information.
Good.
Okay, so we've talked about research and bias. What's next on our psych journey?
Well, you mentioned being fascinated by the brain. Have you heard of this concept called neuroplasticity?
It sounds familiar. It's something about the brain being able to rewire itself, right?
Exactly. For a long time, it was believed that our brains, they became fixed after a certain age. But now we know that our brains are constantly changing and adapting based on our experiences, even in adulthood.
Wait, so you're telling me that every time I learn something new, like a language or a skill, my brain is literally changing its structure?
In a way, yes. Neuroplasticity involves the strengthening or weakening of connections between neurons, those brain communication cells. And when you learn something new, those neural pathways, they become more established.
So the more I practice something, the stronger those connections get, like building a mental muscle.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the incredible power we have to shape our own brains through our actions and experiences.
This is blowing my mind. Okay, so if our brains are so adaptable, does that mean we can recover from brain damage as well?
To a certain extent, yes. Neuroplasticity, it allows the brain to rewire itself after an injury, with other areas taking over the functions of those damaged regions.
That's incredible. So this one concept, neuroplasticity, has huge implications for learning, recovery, and even how we think about our potential.
It really does, and it reinforces the idea that we are not simply products of our genes or our environment, but active participants in shaping our own brains, our own abilities.
I'm starting to see why you find this also fascinating.
Okay.
Okay, so neuroplasticity is one way our brains change. But what about sleep? I saw you highlighted some sections on sleep deprivation and how it impacts us.
Yes. Sleep. Often neglected, but so crucial for a healthy mind. Here's the thing. While we sleep, our brains, they're far from inactive. In fact, sleep plays a critical role in consolidating memories. Essentially, it's strengthening those neural connections we were just talking about.
So that old saying, sleep on it, actually has some scientific backing.
Absolutely. During sleep, our brains, they replay and process information that we've encountered during the day, making those memories more stable, more accessible later on.
That makes sense. I definitely feel sharper after a good night's sleep. But what about when we don't get enough sleep? I know it can make me feel foggy, a little irritable. Are there, more serious consequences?
Unfortunately, yes. Chronic lack of sleep, it doesn't just impair cognitive functions like your attention, your memory, and decision-making. It also has significant impacts on your physical health.
Okay, like what? I'm starting to get a little worried now.
Well, research has linked chronic sleep deprivation to an increased risk of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, even certain types of cancer. It also weakens the immune system, making us more susceptible to infections.
Wow. Okay, I'll admit, I'm definitely guilty of sacrificing sleep sometimes. But knowing it increases the risk of serious health problems like that, like heart disease, it's a real wake-up call. I'm definitely rethinking my late-night Netflix binges.
A good night's sleep is an investment in your health, that's for sure.
It really is.
Speaking of sleep, you flagged a section on dreams. Want to explore that a bit?
Yes. I find dreams fascinating, but they can be so weird. Any breakthroughs in, dream interpretation?
Dream interpretation is still a bit of a mystery, even with all of Freud's theories. But what's really interesting is what researchers are learning about the sleep stages and how they relate to dreaming.
Right, like REM sleep being linked to those really vivid dreams. So if you wake someone up during that stage, they're more likely to remember their dreams.
Precisely. It gets even more intriguing when we consider hypnosis.
Oh yeah, that was another one you flagged. I have to admit, I'm picturing those, cheesy stage shows, but it sounds like there's more to it.
Definitely. Hypnosis, it won't make you do anything that you fundamentally oppose, but it can be used to manage pain, even reduce anxiety. And it's helping researchers understand that complex relationship between our conscious and our unconscious minds.
So it's not about mind control, but more about tapping into the power of suggestion and how our minds work on, different levels.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that our conscious awareness, it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to, our mental processes.
This is all so cool. It's amazing how much we're learning about the brain and all of its complexities. But before we go too deep down that rabbit hole of hypnosis, I'm curious about something else you marked, child development. What are some, key insights there?
Well, one of the most influential figures in child development is Jean Piaget. He proposed that children's cognitive abilities, they develop in stages. Each one has its own unique way of thinking.
So kids aren't just miniature adults. Their brains actually work differently.
Precisely. For example, in the early sensoromotor stage, babies learn about the world through their senses and their motor actions. Think about a baby shaking a rattle. They're learning about cause and effect.
That makes sense. They're like tiny scientists experimenting with their surroundings.
Exactly. And as they get older, they move into the pre-operational stage where they start to use symbols and language. But their thinking is still quite egocentric.
Meaning they see everything from their own perspective.
Yes.
I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes I still struggle with seeing things from other people's point of view.
Well, that's a sign of cognitive development, too. That ability to take on another person's perspective or theory of mind, it's a crucial milestone in social development. It's what allows us to understand that other people have their own thoughts, their own feelings, and motivations, even if they're different from our own.
Makes sense. So understanding these stages can help us better understand how kids learn and, interact with the world.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of providing developmentally appropriate experiences and support for children at each stage.
I'm starting to realize how much psychology can teach us about ourselves and how we function at, any age. Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about one last thing, stress. I know it's a part of life, but I saw you mark some sections on how it, impacts us physically and how we can manage it.
Stress is a fascinating topic because it has such a profound impact on our well-being. When we perceive a threat, our bodies activate this fight or flight response, releasing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol.
So our heart rate goes up, we start sweating, we get that surge of energy. It's like our body is preparing us to either fight the danger or run away from it.
Exactly. And in short bursts, that stress response, it's actually helpful. It allows us to react quickly to threats, to challenges, But
what about when that stress becomes chronic? Like when we're constantly feeling overwhelmed or pressured?
that's where things get problematic. Chronic stress takes a toll on both our physical and mental health. It weakens the immune system, it increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, disrupts your sleep. It can even contribute to mental health issues like anxiety and depression.
Okay, that's definitely not good. So what can we do about it? Are we just supposed to avoid stress altogether?
While it's impossible to eliminate stress entirely, there are effective ways to manage it. One key factor is social support, having strong connections with friends, family, or community members. It can provide a buffer against those stress factors.
It's like having a team to help you through those tough times.
Exactly. And there are also individual coping mechanisms that can be helpful, like exercise, mindfulness, relaxation techniques. It's about finding what works for you.
So it's about finding healthy ways to, like, channel that stress energy and build resilience.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that stress, it is a normal part of life, but it doesn't have to control us. We have the power to develop coping strategies that help us navigate those challenges and maintain our well-being.
This deep dive is already so insightful. I'm learning so much about how my brain works, how my experiences shape me, and how I can take more control of my own well-being. I can't wait to see what other fascinating psych knowledge we uncover in the next part. Okay, so last time we were talking about stress, and I have to admit, I'm still thinking about how much sleep I've been sacrificing. Maybe I should invest in a sleep mask and some blackout curtains.
Those could be helpful for sure. But before you go redecorating your bedroom, I think it's worth exploring another angle on stress, this idea of personality types and how they relate to those feelings of being, overwhelmed.
Right. I've heard of like type A personalities being more prone to stress. What's the deal with that? Is it just about being like super ambitious?
That's what they initially thought. That type A, marked by that drive to achieve, this sense of urgency, maybe a bit of competitiveness, that was a red flag for heart disease. But more recent research, it actually points to the hostility aspect as being the real culprit.
So it's not about wanting to succeed, but more about how you deal with the pressure and maybe even failure.
Exactly. People who tend to react intensely to stress, both physically and emotionally, they often have higher levels of hostility. Think about it, that constant state of fight or flight. It takes a toll.
So if I'm feeling that competitive fire, I need to make sure I'm channeling it in a healthy way, like focusing on my own goals and not getting caught up comparing myself to others.
Now you're getting it. It's all about finding that balance between pushing for achievement, but also keeping a sense of perspective. It's not sustainable to be in that, stressed out state all the time.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any personality types that are particularly good at handling stress?
There's been some interesting research on something called hardy personalities. They tend to see challenges as opportunities rather than threats. So they face stressful situations head on with a sense of control, commitment, a willingness to learn and grow from those experiences.
It's like they have that bring it on attitude, but in a positive way.
Exactly. They view obstacles as a chance to learn, get better, not something to fear and avoid.
I love that. Okay, So we've talked about personality and stress. What about happiness? Everyone wants to be happy, but it feels so elusive sometimes. Is there a secret formula?
If only it were that simple. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But research has actually uncovered some key factors that contribute to happiness, and some of them might surprise you.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Spill beans? What makes people happy?
Well, it turns out material wealth, it plays a much smaller role than most people think. Of course, we need our basic needs met. But after that point, having more money doesn't actually correlate with being happier.
So that whole money can't buy happiness, saying it's actually true.
To a large extent, yes. What matters more are things like strong social connections, having close relationships, feeling like your life has a sense of purpose.
It's less about what you buy and more about how you live your life.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing quality time with loved ones, following your passions, finding those things that give your life meaning. These experiences, they tend to have a much more lasting impact on happiness than, any material possession.
That totally resonates with me. I've definitely gotten more joy from spending time with family and friends or pursuing creative projects than from any like material purchase I could think of.
There you go. That's a perfect example. And it brings up another really interesting finding. We're not always good at predicting what will actually make us happy. We tend to overestimate the impact of material things and underestimate the importance of those social connections, those fulfilling experiences.
So we might be chasing the wrong things in our pursuit of happiness. Like, we need to look beyond the surface.
It's definitely something to consider. It's crucial to be mindful of our values and what truly brings us joy.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired to do a little self-reflection. But before I get too introspective, there's another topic I'm dying to hear more about. The accuracy of lie detectors. Is that like Hollywood magic, or is there real science behind it?
The polygraph, or lie detector test, as it's more commonly known, it is a fascinating tool, but it's not as clear-cut as those crime dramas make it seem. It measures physiological responses like your heart rate, your blood pressure, even how much you sweat, all of which can indicate arousal or stress.
So the idea is that when someone lies, they get nervous and their body, like, gives them away.
That's the theory. But, and this is a big but, those physiological changes, they can be triggered by a lot of things, not just lying.
So you could be totally innocent, but still get stressed out by the situation. And the lie detector could misinterpret that.
Exactly. And there are ways people try to, beat the test, which throws another wrench into its reliability.
So it's not a foolproof method for uncovering the truth. Looks like those courtroom scenes aren't always realistic.
Not quite. While polygraph results are sometimes used in investigations, they're very rarely admissible as evidence in court because of these reliability issues.
That makes sense.
Right.
It's a good reminder to be critical of what we see on TV and to seek out more, reliable sources of information.
Couldn't agree more. It all circles back to understanding the limitations of, any tool or technique, especially when we're dealing with something as complex as human behavior.
This deep dive is making me question everything I thought I knew about psychology. Speaking of questioning things, you flagged that whole nature versus nurture debate, that age-old question of whether we're shaped by our genes or our environment. Where do you stand on that?
That's a question that's fascinated scientists for centuries, and the answer is it's rarely as simple as one or the other. It's almost always a complex interplay of both. It's like our biology, it lays the groundwork, but our experiences, they build upon it.
So it's not about which one is more important, but how they, work together.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Your genes, they might make you predisposed to certain traits or behaviors, let's say being introverted. But your upbringing and your experiences, they can influence how that introversion actually manifests in your life.
So even if I'm, wired to be more reserved, my experience can either amplify or soften that, depending on how I've learned to navigate social situations.
Precisely. And it works both ways. Our environment can actually influence how our genes express themselves. There's a whole field called epigenetics that studies this.
Wait, so you're saying what I do can actually change my DNA?
Not the underlying DNA sequence itself, but how those genes are turned on or turned off.
Okay, that's still pretty mind-blowing. So it's like our choices, our experiences, they can actually leave a mark on our DNA.
It's a bit more nuanced than that, but that's the gist of it. It highlights the incredible interconnectedness of our biology, our environment, our experiences.
That is wild. Okay, before we move on, I'm curious about another area you highlighted, gender differences in sexuality. I know this can be a sensitive topic, so let me know if we need to, sip it. But I'm curious if there's any consensus on what, causes those differences.
It's definitely a complex area, and attributing it to a single cause would be a vast oversimplification. It's not a matter of nature or nurture, but this fascinating blend of biological, psychological, and social factors all weaving together.
So it's more about how these various influences interact to shape our experiences, our expressions of sexuality.
Exactly. For example, there are hormonal differences between men and women that can influence things like sexual desire, behavior, but those hormonal influences are also shaped by cultural norms, societal expectations. It's like this intricate dance between biology and environment.
So it's not just about our biology, dictating everything. It's about how we as individuals interpret and act on those impulses within a certain social context.
Precisely. And it's incredibly important to recognize that these are just general patterns. There's a wide spectrum of variation within each gender. We can't overlook the diversity of human experience.
Right. We can't just put people in neat little boxes based on gender. It's about recognizing the spectrum.
This deep dive is making me want to rethink so many things. Speaking of which, you flagged this other fascinating idea, that natural behavior isn't always so simple. You had some examples from the animal kingdom that really got me thinking. The animal kingdom is full of surprises. What we observe in nature, it can challenge a lot of our assumptions about what's considered natural or instinctual. For instance, there are documented cases of same-sex pairings, even homosexual behavior in various animal species.
Really? I always thought that was like a uniquely human thing.
It's far more common in the animal kingdom than many people realize. And these observations suggest that same-sex attraction behavior might be more deeply rooted in our evolutionary history than we previously thought. It definitely complicates the narrative, right?
It really does. It makes you wonder how much of our behavior is truly hardwired versus influenced by, culture and societal norms.
Precisely. It highlights the importance of questioning our assumptions and being open to new perspectives. What we assume to be true about ourselves and the world around us, it's often just the tip of the iceberg.
This deep dive is seriously expanding my horizons.
Yeah.
Okay, ready for the final leg of our psych journey. All right, ready to wrap up this psych marathon. Where are we headed next on our deep dive?
Well, since you brought up that whole idea of natural behavior not always being what we expect, I think it's the perfect segue into this whole topic of intelligence.
Okay.
It's another one of those areas where we often make assumptions about, what's innate versus what's learned.
Right, like that whole debate about IQ. Is it really like a fixed measure of how smart you are, or is there more to the story?
It's definitely more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
While those IQ tests, they can measure certain cognitive abilities like logic, pattern recognition, memory. They don't capture the full spectrum of human intelligence.
So it's not just about how well you do on like a standardized test. It's about how you navigate the real world, understand yourself, connect with others. All of that factors in.
Exactly. And the good news is that research suggests these different types of intelligence, they can be cultivated, they can be developed.
Yep.
It's not all predetermined at birth.
That's reassuring to hear. I always felt like those IQ tests were a bit limiting, like they were putting people in a box.
They can be if we let them. It's important to remember that intelligence is multifaceted, it's dynamic, it's about our capacity to learn, to adapt, to solve problems in different ways. We all have our strengths.
I'm realizing through this deep dive that so much of what we think we know about psychology is based on these like outdated or overly simplistic notions.
It's true. And that's why it's so important to stay curious, engage with the research, to keep asking questions and challenging those assumptions. The field of psychology is constantly evolving. There are new discoveries being made all the time.
That's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about exploring the mysteries of the human mind.
Yeah.
It feels like every answer just leads to more questions.
Exactly. And it's about taking that knowledge and using it to understand ourselves and the people around us a little bit better, hopefully leading to, a more fulfilling, more meaningful life.
That's a great point. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what's one of the most mind-blowing things you've learned in your study of psychology?
Oh, that's a tough one. There are so many. But one thing that continues to fascinate me is the power of the placebo effect.
You mean when people experience a benefit from a treatment, even if it turns out to be like sugar pill or something?
Precisely. It highlights the incredible power our minds have to influence our bodies and our overall experiences. Just the belief that something is helping can, in some cases, trigger real, measurable changes.
That's amazing. It's like our brains can actually trick us into feeling better.
In a way, yes. It just goes to show how powerful our thoughts, our beliefs, our expectations can be, even when it comes to our, physical well-being.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing the world and myself in a whole new light.
That's what I love to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. There's a whole universe of fascinating information out there.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep learning. And for anyone listening, if this sparked your curiosity, I highly encourage you to explore the source material for yourselves. You might be amazed at what you discover.
Happy exploring.
This has been another episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.